Phil here from Amnocally Tanked, and today I'm going to try to cut down on my massive backlog of half-finished projects, specifically this squad of 10 Mark 6 Space Marines for the Horus Heresy, and I'm going to try to get all of these finished to a good standard in under 3 hours. I started off by mixing a couple of drops of Scale 75 Violet ink into Vallejo metal colored magnesium and applying an even layer over a black base coat. My plan for these Marines was to paint them in a metallic red color, as you can kind of cheat a bit with your highlights, as metallic paint will hide poor highlight placement much more than matte paints will. And because I was going for speed with these guys, I figured I should take any shortcuts I could possibly get away with. You might also be wondering why I mixed some purple into this base coat, and that's because I really like using purple as a shade for red. And when applying transparent paints over this base coat, as it will later on, a slight amount of purple will interact with the red on top and provide some subtle but interesting contrast to my shadows. Up next, I do a very quick zenithal highlight of Vallejo metal color aluminum, making sure to hit at least one side of each of the legs, as well as a general spritz over the top of the model. I am not going to get too much further into the placement of these highlights here, but if you have any questions, please leave a comment below. After the aluminum highlight, I applied 2 layers of Games Workshop Blood Angels red contrast paint over the entire model. I haven't really used contrast paints too much before, but I really liked how they went on through an airbrush here as a transparent paint, and I thought the deep, rich red of Blood Angels red was perfect for the look I was going for here. Unsurprisingly. I found, however, that I needed to get 2 layers of this on to get a saturated red look that I wanted. Otherwise, the colors looked a little bit washed out. If you've not used contrast or any transparent paint before, for that matter, they work a bit differently than opaque paints, as additional layers of transparent paint will only further saturate the color you are using, while evening out the volumes underneath, whereas more layers of an opaque paint will eventually result in full opacity being reached and all volumes underneath being covered up. Said practically, not in paint nerd terms, this means that transparent paints will make your shadows a little bit lighter and your highlights a little bit darker. This is why I used 2 pretty extreme metal colors here, in magnesium at the dark end and aluminum at the light end, as the difference in those 2 values, or how bright each of those are comparatively, will be toned down with the ball red overcoats. Speaking of highlights and contrast, I decided to ignore the speed painting mantra of getting this done fast and dirty, and push my volumes a little bit more in this model. I did this by applying another zenithal highlight of aluminum, but a little more kind of targeted than before, and I really just wanted to hit the very top of the model. Over this, I sprayed a single layer of Pro Acryl Transparent Red. This layer was applied so it completely covered up the second round of aluminum highlights, but I wasn't too worried about getting any of the overspray elsewhere on the model, as again, this is a transparent paint and it would all kind of just blend together. I actually received this Pro Acryl Transparent paint set from a viewer who had asked for my opinions on how it would work for a Thousand Suns paint scheme. Unfortunately, I found that this red had a bit of a magenta tint to it, which kind of threw off the candy red I was going for. However, this made it a really interesting highlight color for this Blood Angel scheme, as it adds just a little bit of different color variation, much like the purple we used before. After about 30 minutes of airbrush work, I was pretty much done with the main armor color and pretty happy with my progress so far. I still had a bunch of detailing work to do though, which I was really dreading. This fiddly detail work on Space Marine models is absolutely one of the biggest time killers, as you need to base coat, shade, and highlight multiple different colors, and even with batch painting, it can really drag on. For this squad though, I decided to do another little hobby hack utilizing oil paints to try to skip as many of the individual painting steps as possible. I figured that by just doing a base coat on the majority of the silver and black details, I could then utilize the black oil wash I was already planning on doing for the armor to do the rest of the shading for me easily. So with this in mind, I set off to paint every single silver detail with Scale 75 heavy metal. I really like the Scale 75 metallic paints, so that's what I use here, but really, you can use whatever medium silver for this step you have on hand. It took me about 3 minutes per Marine to get all the silver down, so with about an hour of work total for this squad, I have these models to a fairly decent standard that all is really missing is bolter casings and a couple of other details to get them to a good tabletop standard. Next up, I used Scale 75 Abyssal Blue on all the bolter casings. As mentioned previously, I'm going to be using a lamp black oil wash later on, so I do not want to use a pure black here, and Abyssal Blue is a pretty nice desaturated blue that I think will read nicely as black once the oils are applied. Before doing the oil wash though, I decided to apply the Legion badges over the left shoulder pad, and I was hoping to save a varnish step later on. My process for doing decals is usually I brush on some gloss varnish to the area I want to apply the decals on, place the decal there, once the varnish is dried, apply microsol to the transfer, and then seal it in with either gloss varnish or matte varnish once everything else is dried. I wanted to do the transfers at this step so I could combine the last varnish step of sealing in the transfer with the needed gloss varnish step of my oil wash process. So by doing everything in this sequence, I probably shaved off about 5 to 10 minutes of doing a varnish step with my airbrush when you consider setup and takedown time. I wanted to note this here because I think it's important that when you're painting for speed as well as quality, you should think through the sequence that you're going through and try to cut out any unnecessary steps possible, as you can incrementally speed up your process and get more models painted faster. Once I had this last gloss varnish layer on, I left the models to dry overnight to ensure that the varnish was completely dry before moving on to oils. If you recall back in my Argyle Tall video, I ran into some issues with oil staining due to a still wet varnish, and I was not about to let that happen again. So, after an hour and 36 minutes of painting, I felt like I was in a pretty good spot here as the vast majority of the models were painted, and all that was left was an oil wash, sponge chipping, and some minor details. I should be able to finish this in another hour and 24 minutes, right? I started off the next day by mixing up a black oil wash, using lamp black oil paint from Winsor & Newton with some Gamsol thinner. I don't have an exact ratio I use for this wash. I generally try to get it to about the consistency of 2% milk. If it's too thick, it won't flow into the recesses and nooks and crannies of your model easily enough, but if it's too thin, the oil paint will actually break down and give you a grainy texture to your wash. This is then applied fairly liberally to all the recesses in the Marine's armor. I try to be careful here, but it's okay if I get a little bit where it doesn't belong, as I can wipe it away in the next step. This is actually one of the reasons why I love oil washes to paint a line instead of something like Games Workshop shades, as you can go pretty quickly here and don't need to be very careful, as you can always wipe away any mistakes. Oil washes do take quite a while to dry though, so after applying this wash, I stepped away from my painting desk for about an hour and moved right over to my building desk so I could crank out even more Mark 6 Marines. You do want to make sure that the oils are dry completely before trying to remove them, as otherwise you run the risk of smearing the paint and pulling it out of the recesses more easily. One way to tell when the paint is dry is it will turn matte and look very kind of flat as opposed to the glossy look it has when you first apply it. If you're impatient though, you can always speed this process up by using a hairdryer. To remove this oil wash, all I do is take some foam makeup removers and gently wipe away the paint where I misplaced it. There are a few instances though where the oil was being a bit stubborn, so all I had to do to remove this was dip one end of the foam into some clean Gamsol, dab the excess off, and use this to gently wipe away the stubborn black oil paint. This works because the Gamsol reactivates the oil and makes it so you can easily wipe it away from the raised portions of your model. You do need to be careful here though, not to apply too much pressure, otherwise you might remove too much oil and get it out of the nooks and crannies where you want it to stay. Next up, I spray the model with one more coat of varnish to lock the oils in. I used Vallejo matte varnish though at this step, as it's actually fairly satin and I like how it looks over colored metallic schemes. It's not too glossy, it's not too matte, it's just right. This varnish step will lock your oil paints in though and make them harder to remove later on, so I'd highly recommend doing a once over check over your models to make sure there's no rogue oil stains. It's taken me about 2 hours and 15 minutes to get to this point, and I think it's going to be a pretty tight sprint to the finish to hit my 3-hour goal. I still need to add some sort of highlight to the model as well to get them to a point I'm happy with, so in order to save both time and add some texture to the model, I decided to go with one of my favorite techniques, sponge chipping. I used black metal from scale 75 here, as I really like how silvers look for the chipping step over metallic schemes. I wanted this model to still have a pretty dark appearance though, which is why I think a light silver would have thrown it off, so I used this darker black metal. There are a few places though that I couldn't easily reach with my sponge, and normally I use a fine detail brush to stipple on my chipping color. I didn't have time for that though, so instead I used my hobby knife to gently scrape away the top layer of clear reds to expose the earlier layers of silver underneath. This physical removal of the red paint worked so well that I decided to try it on some of the flat pieces of armor as well, which I did in 2 ways. The first was I took the point of my knife and dragged it across the armor to make long scratches. And the second was I very gently took the flat part of my blade and rubbed it against the armor to physically add chips to it. I didn't really have any rhyme or reason to where I placed these scratches, and just went quickly and had fun with it. This was a bit nerve-wracking at first, as removing paint is generally not something you want to do. I think it added a nice natural and organic appearance to my weathering that I really liked. All said and done, this weathering step took me right to the 2 hour and 36 minute mark, and I had a choice to make at this point. Besides the bases, I was left with the sergeant's helmet, leather bolter straps, the vexilla, as well as a couple of random metal details, and while I might have been able to push through and finish all these in 14 minutes, I really just want to slop on some paint just for the sake of meeting a deadline. For the gold parts, including the sergeant's helmet, all I did was apply a layer of Scale 75 Necro Gold, a wash of Games Workshop Seraphim Sepia shade, and another layer of Necro Gold. I find that the matte nature of the Games Workshop shade really helps to add some contrast to the metallic paint, and I'm pretty happy with the results I was able to get with just a base coat, shade, and one more layer. Next up, the crest on the sergeant's helmet was also painted fairly quickly, with a layer of Abyssal Blue, followed up by a rough highlight of Burying Blue, and then a coat of Black Templar contrast paint from Games Workshop. This was very rough, then looks like horse hair and looks pretty good, so I guess I'm okay with it. Because I was already over my time allotment, I decided to spend a bit more time on the eyes, and really push the Angels of Death vibe I was going for, and gave these Marines red glowing eyes. For these, I just followed my glowing eye lens process, which is basically a base coat of white, layer of Floor Red from Green Stuff World, wash of Games Workshop Carenburn Crimson, a layer of white again, and then one more layer of Floor Red. I have a more detailed video of this process on my channel, which I've linked in the upper right hand corner of this video if you're interested. To finish the squad off, there are a few more details like the vexilla and leather, which you can paint in whichever manner you choose. I also started off doing my bases in an urban rebel scheme, but I found that it was a bit dark with the deep red armor, so I added some Tamiya snow effects to the bases to lighten them up. So there we have it. This squad ended up taking about 4 hours and 15 minutes all said and done, with the vast majority of that taken up by detailing after the core armor color was done. This is a bit over my original goal of 3 hours, but I'm really happy with the results, and I'm going to be proud to put these on the tabletop, so it's all good. As always, I welcome any comments you have on this scheme, and I hope this video encourages you to try your own metallic paint schemes. Thanks for watching, and hobby on.